So I remember getting there about noon, and Hogan was already there. And I'm walking down the
Red
hall.
flag number one.
Red flag number one, right? So he goes, hey kid, can I talk to you, right? So we go into one of the locker rooms, into the shower.
The Undertaker has finally spoken about his earliest encounters with Hulk Hogan, and it turns out Hogan may not have been the hero fans always believed him to be. From strange behavior behind the scenes to quiet manipulation, Undertaker is now revealing details about the people Hogan hurt. It all started with a shocking revelation that changed the wrestling world forever on November 27, 1991 at Survivor Series, when a new supernatural character known as The Undertaker defeated this legendary Hulk Hogan to win his very first WWE Championship. What should have been a proud and career-defining moment for the young Mark Calloway instead became an example of backstage politics and manipulation that would haunt him for years. To understand how big this moment really was, we have to go back to that point in wrestling history when The Undertaker, barely a year into his WWE career, was preparing to face the biggest star in the company and perhaps the biggest name in wrestling history. Hulk Hogan was not just the champion, he was the face of WWE, the man who carried the company through its most successful era, and a larger-than-life icon who had gone beyond wrestling to become a global star. But on this day, things were not the same, because as Undertaker later revealed in a very open interview, the real setup had already started before the match even began. In a statement that shocked the wrestling community, Undertaker explained the calculated nature of what many people believed was a real injury, and he recalled that the confrontation had actually begun earlier that day.
Back then, we would usually show up noon, on a TV or pay-per-view day. We show up at the arena around noon, 1 o'clock. Hogan would roll in about 4 or 5. So I remember getting there about noon, and Hogan was already there.
This small and seemingly harmless detail would later become the first warning sign in what The Undertaker now understands was a carefully planned setup. The fact that Hogan, who had a reputation for always arriving late to shows, was already at the arena hours earlier than usual should have been enough to raise suspicion. But The Undertaker, still young and eager to prove himself, had no clue what was about to happen. The plan moved forward as Hogan walked up to the rising star with what appeared to be genuine concern.
Red flag number one.
Red flag number one, right? So he goes, hey kid, can I talk to you, right? So we go into one of the locker rooms, into the shower, right? That's where all the business was always done.
Hogan's acting that day was nothing short of Oscar-worthy, as The Undertaker remembers. Hogan came up to him saying, hey, I've got this neck injury, and admitted he was nervous about taking The Undertaker's finishing move. The Undertaker's reply showed his professionalism and his focus on keeping others safe in the ring, as he reassured Hogan by saying, Hulk, trust me, I will protect you. I take pride in never hurting anyone, and I promise I'll hold you so securely that there's no way you'll injure your neck. But according to The Undertaker, the mental pressure from Hogan did not stop there and continued to build throughout the entire day. Intro.
Every point during the day, I'd pass him in the hall or whatnot, I'd get the, remember about my neck, right? So that's all I got all day was my neck.
When the match finally happened, The Undertaker delivered the Tombstone pile driver with absolute care and precision, making sure Hogan was held so tightly that there was no real chance of injury. The move was executed perfectly, but Hogan's reaction came instantly. As Undertaker recalls, I picked him up and I promise you I had him locked in safely. Boom, I hit the tombstone, and the moment my knees touched the mat, I heard him say, oh, you got me, brother. My neck and my back, my neck and my back. Over time, as other wrestlers began to speak up, the truth slowly came out. Since there was no Monday Night Raw back then, Undertaker only saw the footage later during house shows, but by that point, many of the boys in the locker room were already coming to him, shaking their heads and pointing out that Hogan's head never even came close to hitting the mat.
When you watch it back, you can tell his head never touched. And so now I'm in this precarious situation, I'm still a greenhorn, right? I mean, and now I've got to confront, the face of wrestling, the biggest draw, ever.
The long-awaited confrontation finally took place in San Antonio, and Hogan's response told The Undertaker everything he needed to know about the man behind the larger-than-life character. Yet The Undertaker soon realized his story was not unique, as more wrestlers began speaking out about their own experiences with Hulk Hogan, revealing a disturbing pattern of manipulation and career sabotage that stretched across decades of professional wrestling. Among the most explosive and well-documented accusations came from Bret the Hitman Hart, who believed Hogan broke a promise that changed the direction of his career forever. The story traces back to WrestleMania 9 in 1993, when Hart defended the WWE Championship against Yokozuna. After Hart lost due to outside interference, Hogan rushed in and defeated Yokozuna in an impromptu match that lasted less than 30 seconds, completely stealing the spotlight from Hart. According to Hart's detailed account, Hogan had promised him afterward that he would repay the favor by putting Hart over in a future match. But when the moment came for their scheduled SummerSlam 1993 showdown, Hogan refused to go through with it. The heated backstage confrontation that followed was witnessed by several people, including Brutus Beefcake, Jimmy Hart, and referee Dave Hebner. Bret Hart's memory of that confrontation shows just how deep his frustration ran as he confronted Hogan directly by saying, "You told me at WrestleMania 9 that you'd be happy to return the favor, and now I hear you don't even want to work with me. You refuse to put me over, and you claim I'm not in your league." Hart's anger finally boiled over when he ended the exchange with, "On behalf of myself, my family, and most of the boys in the locker room, you can go yourself." Hogan's dismissive attitude toward Hart's accusations never faded, and even decades later it showed, like in 2018 when a fan mentioned Hart in 1993, and Hogan replied with condescension, saying, "Back before you were born, we were still drawing huge money. His era didn't start yet, Lowell." That short reply revealed how little respect Hogan had for Hart, even long after their rivalry, ignoring Hart's status as champion and main event star at the time. The same troubling pattern was seen with Shawn Michaels, who claimed Hogan backed him out of a planned best-of-3 series, forcing Michaels to lose at SummerSlam 2005, which hurt his momentum during what was supposed to be a major comeback. Yet perhaps the most damaging of Hogan's actions came in his treatment of hardcore legend Mick Foley. In 2002, Hogan made comments that were not only professionally damaging, but also deeply personal, calling Mick Foley nothing more than a glorified stuntman and even claiming that he trained more in a single week than Foley had in 3 decades. His attack on Foley's work ethic was especially harsh, painting him as lazy and unprofessional, while holding himself up as the model of discipline and training. By attacking Foley's character and dedication in public, Hogan was clearly trying to weaken Foley's reputation in both the wrestling community and with fans. Foley responded calmly but firmly, defending his career by pointing to his matches with legends like The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Shawn Michaels, while also labeling Hogan's statements as cruel lies. He even added that Hogan would likely struggle in a match with him because Hogan disliked physical contact in the ring. The most shocking twist came years later in 2018, when Hogan himself admitted to using politics to secure his place at the top. In an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, Hogan openly stated, "Once I got in the top spot, to keep the spot, that's where the politics come in." And went on to say, "That's why I made more money than anybody. That's why I held the belt longer. That's why instead of a 5 or 6 or 10-year run like The Rock or Stone Cold or other wrestlers, I had a 35-year run on top." While he didn't directly name the wrestlers he blocked, many had already gone public with accusations that Hogan refused to put them over, the wrestling term for losing a match to help elevate someone else's career. The evidence makes it clear that wrestlers like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were among those directly affected by Hogan's admitted use of politics to protect his spot at the top. The damage caused by his manipulation went far beyond single careers, reshaping the entire direction of wrestling history. Rising stars who should have been pushed into the main event scene found their momentum stalled, their chances limited, and their futures forever altered because of Hogan's self-serving choices. The overall pattern that emerges from these stories is undeniable, showing how Hulk Hogan consistently manipulated circumstances to secure his dominance, no matter what it cost others. Whether it was fabricating injuries, breaking promises, publicly tearing down another wrestler's reputation, or using backstage politics, Hogan used every tactic available to make sure no one could truly threaten his place. The wrestlers who spoke out, Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, and others, were not just victims of isolated situations, but part of a larger system of control built to keep Hogan on top at any price. Yet while his manipulation of fellow wrestlers painted a disturbing picture of wrestling politics, the most shocking and painful allegations would come from inside his own family circle. The same pattern of manipulation and betrayal that defined Hogan's professional life proved even more destructive when directed at those closest to him, showing that his need for control and gratification reached far beyond the wrestling ring and into the most personal parts of his life. The most explosive and widely covered scandal came in 2007, when Hogan had an affair with Christiane Plant, his daughter Brooke's best friend. This was not just an affair, it was a devastating betrayal that struck at the very heart of family. Trust, involving someone who should have been under his protection as a father figure. Christiane Plant was not a casual acquaintance, but someone deeply connected to the Hogan family, working with Brooke on her 2006 album and considered part of their inner circle. The affair became public in 2008 when Plant admitted in an interview with the National Enquirer that her relationship with Hogan began at a time when his marriage to Linda Hogan was already falling apart. Yet the timing and circumstances exposed a troubling pattern of predatory behavior, as Plant was 21 years younger than Hogan, closer in age to his daughter than to him, and was in a position of trust within the family home. For Brooke Hogan, who was only 19 when the revelation came out, the betrayal was crushing, and her public reaction showed just how deeply hurt and angry she felt. Brooke Hogan's response to the scandal was raw and direct, as she said, "I think she should have thought about what kind of press she was going to get when she slept with her best friend's famous father. I think we're all seeing just exactly how karma works. Christiane, nothing you say will ever put my family back together." Yet the affair with Plant was only the beginning of a much darker pattern of manipulation and control within the Hogan family, one that carried devastating, long-term consequences. According to detailed reports released in 2025, Brooke has made serious allegations of extreme verbal and mental abuse going back to her childhood, with claims that at times it even became physical. In a 2025 statement to the media, Brooke revealed, "I have been extremely verbally and mentally abused since childhood. Sadly, it would frequently turn physical, and sometimes it's not by the person you would assume. Abuse comes in all shapes and sizes." She further described receiving cruel and degrading text messages, being humiliated with hurtful words both privately and publicly, and being constantly manipulated, lied to, and treated as a pawn. Brooke explained how this psychological manipulation often forced her to defend bad behavior in public, only to later discover she had been misled, exposing a clear pattern of grooming tactics designed to protect Hogan's image, no matter the personal cost to his own family. The long-term effects of this alleged manipulation are clear in Brooke's current relationship with her parents, as she revealed that after setting boundaries that were repeatedly ignored, she ultimately chose to cut off all contact with both of them. She has since entered therapy to work through the impact of her upbringing, stressing that her main focus now is protecting her own life and children from further harm. The family conflict became even more complicated when Linda Hogan responded to Brooke's allegations, not with support, but with denial, calling her daughter a narcissist and accusing her of being drunk and violent, even claiming Brooke had broken her collarbone and cut her lip. This pattern of denying, deflecting, and counterattacking closely resembles the same tactics Hulk Hogan was accused of using against fellow wrestlers who dared to oppose him. Yet Linda herself has also spoken about being a victim of Hogan's manipulation and abuse. During their 24-year marriage, from 1983 to 2009, she accused him of constant infidelity, describing him as both a sex addict and a liar, and pointed to his affair with Christiane Plant as the final breaking point that led her to file for divorce. In November 2007, the pattern of manipulation within the Hogan family went beyond emotional and psychological abuse and even extended into the public eye through their reality show, Hogan Knows Best, which aired from 2005 to 2007. The show became a tool Hogan used to control the family narrative, portraying himself as a protective father while simultaneously placing his family under constant public scrutiny and pressure. Linda later admitted in 2006 that the series only made family tensions worse, saying, "We can endure. It's just that sometimes it's the superficial stuff on the surface that is just hard to deal with." By using the reality show format, Hogan was able to normalize controlling behavior under the guise of loving protection, a form of public grooming that served his image but harmed his family. Another disturbing example of betrayal came from Hogan's relationship with Bubba the Love Sponge, also known as Bubba Clem, who had been his best friend and even his best man. Bubba revealed in a later interview that their friendship fell apart after the infamous sex tape scandal, explaining that Hogan had been living with him during one of the lowest points of his life and took advantage of what Bubba described as a somewhat open relationship. The fallout from this scandal not only destroyed their friendship, but also left permanent damage to both men's lives and reputations. The pattern of exploiting personal relationships for selfish gain was also clear in the way Hogan handled family crises. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions or making genuine efforts to repair broken bonds, he often deflected blame and cast himself as the victim. Even decades later, the consequences of his alleged manipulation continued to echo through his family. Reports from 2025 revealed that Brooke remained estranged from both of her parents up until Hogan's death, with reconciliation never happening, despite his reported attempts to make amends in his final months. The allegations surrounding Hogan's family life paint the picture of a man who treated those closest to him not as loved ones deserving care and respect, but as tools to be used for his own advantage. From grooming his daughter's best friend to allegedly abusing his own children, from betraying his closest friend to manipulating his wife, Hogan's personal relationships reflected the same cycle of control and exploitation that defined his career in wrestling. The psychological toll of this behavior on his family was immense, as seen in Brooke's need for therapy. her choice to cut ties with both parents, and her stated fear of protecting her own children from growing up in the same environment where manipulation and control were disguised as love and protection. The word grooming in this context carries its full weight, describing the deliberate process of building trust and emotional connection for the sole purpose of exploitation. In both his professional relationships with younger wrestlers and his personal relationships with family and friends, Hulk Hogan followed the same pattern, earning trust, establishing control, and then using that power for his own gain, no matter the cost to others. As the year 2025 began, Hogan faced a reality he had never known before, one defined by mortality and a legacy overshadowed by decades of manipulation and betrayal. The man who once stood in front of sold-out arenas filled with screaming fans was now facing a reckoning of a far more private and painful kind. His final months were marked by a desperate effort to repair the very relationships he had spent decades tearing apart, with reports suggesting that in his last weeks he made attempts to reconnect with estranged loved ones, knowing it might be his final opportunity. This was not the behavior of someone unaware of the damage he had left behind, but rather of a man who at last seemed to recognize the true cost of the manipulative choices that had defined his life. Hogan's health had declined severely in his final year, with reports describing a weak heart, constant shortness of breath, extreme fatigue, and noticeable weight loss. He required oxygen support and had recently undergone an intense procedure, a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy infusion, known as ACDF surgery, which came with a long and painful recovery process. One insider remarked in April 2025 that years in the wrestling ring had left him with the body of a 140-year-old man, a stark reminder of the brutal physical price of his decades-long career. Yet, as heavy as the physical toll was, the emotional isolation he faced in his final months was even more significant. Brooke Hogan had remained estranged from both parents for 8 years leading up to his death, distancing herself as a direct result of the alleged abuse and manipulation she had endured throughout her life. Despite Hogan's belief that they would eventually reconcile, that moment never came. The tragic irony of his last months cannot be ignored. A man who had spent decades grooming and manipulating those around him now found himself desperately trying to repair the damage. But the very people he had once controlled had found their own voices, established boundaries, and refused to be pulled back into the cycle of abuse. On the morning of July 24th, 2025, the story of one of wrestling's most controversial figures came to an end. Hogan was found unresponsive at his home in Clearwater, Florida, with emergency services called at 9:51 a.m. and his death pronounced at 11:17 a.m. at Morton Plant Hospital after being transported by Sunstar. The preliminary cause of death was confirmed as cardiac arrest by the Clearwater Police Department, with no signs of foul play suspected. The reaction to Hogan's death was just as complicated and controversial as his life had been. While WWE and several wrestling personalities released official statements offering condolences and praising his contributions to the industry, the larger conversation quickly shifted toward the darker sides of his legacy. Even in passing, those closest to Hogan wrestled with conflicting emotions, as seen in memorial discussions where former friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the man the public admired with the person they knew behind closed doors. Ric Flair called him an incredible athlete, talent, friend, and father, while Donald Trump praised him on Truth Social. But these glowing tributes stood in stark contrast to the serious allegations raised by those who knew him most personally. The wrestling community itself was sharply divided. Some chose to highlight his role in taking wrestling to the mainstream, while others used his death as a moment to finally speak openly about the damage he had allegedly caused backstage. Hogan's own 2018 admission that he relied on politics to stay on top gained new weight after his death. His words about keeping his spot and boasting of a 35-year run at the top were now interpreted through The Undertaker's accounts and other wrestlers' accusations, exposing a larger truth. Historians and journalists began reassessing his career, seeing the alleged manipulation, whether it was the staged injury in 1991 or the consistent holding down of younger talent, not as random events, but as part of a calculated and ongoing strategy to preserve his dominance at any cost. सबसे ज़्यादा noticeable चीज़ होगन की डेथ के बाद दिए गए ट्रिब्यूट्स में उन्होंने की one of the most telling signs after Hogan's death was the silence of certain voices. Brooke Hogan, estranged from her father for 8 years, offered no public statement, and that absence spoke louder than words about the lasting weight of the alleged abuse and manipulation she endured. Within wrestling, the industry was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how such behavior could be protected and overlooked for so long. The stories of Hogan manipulating The Undertaker in 1991, breaking promises to Bret Hart, undermining Mick Foley, and the allegations of abuse within his own family painted a troubling picture of an environment where star power often outweighed basic human decency. The complexity of his legacy was perhaps most visible in the memorial discussions, where those who knew him best struggled to reconcile the larger-than-life hero fans adored with the private man accused of causing deep personal harm. Some, like Darren Prince, his longtime friend and agent, spoke warmly of his generosity, saying he was the type who would give you the shirt off his back, and that his fans meant everything to him. Yet even these tributes carried an acknowledgement of his flaws and the undeniable harm left in his wake. Others, like Bubba the Love Sponge, shared more conflicted emotions, admitting their love for Hogan while also acknowledging the pain his actions had caused. Questions about Hogan's legacy only grew more complicated as details of his final years came to light. Reports suggested he kept working, despite doctors urging him to slow down, a choice that may have contributed to his early death. In the end, the man who had allegedly spent decades manipulating others may have become a victim of his own refusal to leave the spotlight. The wrestling industry's reckoning with Hogan's legacy goes far beyond him as an individual, raising broader issues about power, abuse, and accountability in professional wrestling. The behavior described by The Undertaker and others, the calculated manipulation of younger wrestlers, the use of fabricated injuries to hold his place, and the exploitation of personal relationships, highlighted a darker side of wrestling culture that the industry still struggles to face. In death, Hogan's true legacy may not be measured by the championships he won or the arenas he filled, but by the conversations sparked about manipulation, power, and the heavy price of unchecked ambition. The wrestlers who spoke out, like The Undertaker, Bret Hart, and Mick Foley, forced the wrestling world to face truths it had long ignored. And family members like Brooke Hogan, who found the courage to speak openly about alleged abuse and set boundaries to protect her own children, represent a very different kind of legacy, one built on strength, breaking harmful cycles, and refusing to stay silent. That courage may ultimately prove more meaningful than any of Hogan's wrestling achievements. As the wrestling world continues to reflect on Hogan's death and reevaluate his legacy, the accounts shared by The Undertaker and others serve as a stark reminder that behind the glitz and spectacle of professional wrestling are real people whose lives were deeply impacted by those in positions of power. The alleged patterns of grooming, manipulation, and abuse that marked Hogan's personal and professional relationships stand as a warning about the dangers of unchecked influence and the necessity of holding even the biggest stars accountable. The final chapter of Hulk Hogan's story is no longer being written by him, but by those who claim to have suffered under his shadow, people who have found the strength to speak out and ensure that his version of history is not the only one remembered. Through their courage to speak truth to power, they have guaranteed that Hogan's legacy will be defined not only by his in-ring accomplishments, but also by the lasting and sometimes painful impact he left on those around him. If you enjoyed this video, tap the card on your screen for more stories like this.